The hospital never truly slept. Even in the quiet hours before dawn, there was always a low hum, machines beeping softly, distant footsteps in the hallway, hushed voices passing urgent updates. It was the kind of place where time felt different, where every second carried weight. She stepped through the sliding doors just before her shift began, adjusting the strap of her worn bag on her shoulder. Her uniform was neatly pressed, though slightly faded from years of use. She wasn't new to nursing, but she was new here. And in a place like this, that made all the difference. People moved quickly around her, each person focused, each one already belonging. She paused for a brief moment near the entrance, taking it all in, the unfamiliar layout, the faces that didn't look her way, the feeling of being just another name on a schedule no one had time to read. Then she exhaled quietly and walked forward. At the nurse's station, conversations overlapped. Charts were passed, updates were given, and names of patients were spoken like they carried stories no one had time to fully tell. She waited at the edge, not wanting to interrupt, until someone finally noticed her. "You're the new one, right?" A nurse asked without looking up for long. She nodded. "Yes. I start today." The nurse gave a quick, polite smile, the kind that ended almost as soon as it began. "You'll be assigned to Ward C. It's busy. You'll catch on." That was all. No welcome, no introductions. Just instructions. She didn't mind. She had worked in places like this before. Places where kindness existed, but time didn't always allow it to show. Ward C was louder than the rest of the hospital. Monitors beeped more frequently, footsteps were quicker, and conversations carried a sharper edge. It was the kind of ward where every patient required close attention, and every decision mattered. As she stepped inside, she immediately noticed something else: tension. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, woven into the way doctors spoke to each other, the way nurses exchanged glances, the way certain charts were handled more carefully than others. There was something going on. She moved quietly, observing as she began her duties, checking vitals, adjusting drips, offering small reassurances to patients who needed them. Her movements were calm and steady, practiced over years of experience. She didn't rush, even when the pace around her tried to pull her faster. It didn't take long before she heard it. "That's the case." The words came from two doctors standing near the far end of the ward. Their voices were low, but not low enough to hide the frustration. 18 specialists, one of them said, shaking his head slightly. 18. And still nothing definitive. The other side. Every test looks normal, then suddenly it doesn't. Symptoms shift. It doesn't follow anything we know. She didn't mean to listen, but the words stayed with her. 18 experts. She glanced toward the direction they were looking. At the far corner of the ward, behind a partially drawn curtain, was a single bed. It didn't look different from the others, but something about it drew attention. Staff passed by it more often. Some slowed down. Some didn't look at it at all. That must be the patient. For a moment, she considered walking over, but she held back. She was new. There were routines, unspoken rules. It was better to observe first, to understand the flow before stepping into something she didn't fully know yet. Still, curiosity settled quietly in her chest. As the morning moved on, she learned small things. The patient had been there for days. No one could agree on a clear diagnosis. Every test brought more confusion than answers. And despite all the expertise surrounding the case, the condition wasn't improving. It was unusual. Not just because it was difficult, but because of how it made people react. Experienced doctors grew quieter when discussing it. Confident voices softened. Decisions were made carefully, as if everyone was aware they were walking through uncertainty. By midday, she finally found herself near that corner. The curtain was slightly open now, just enough to see inside, without stepping in. The patient lay still, eyes closed, breathing steady but shallow. There was no dramatic movement, no obvious distress. If anything, it looked calm. Too calm, considering everything she had heard. A monitor beside the bed displayed numbers that changed slowly. Nothing alarming at first glance. Nothing that would immediately explain why 18 experts had struggled. She stood there for a second longer than she intended. Then she stepped inside. Quietly, she approached the bed, her movements gentle, almost instinctive. She checked the chart at the foot of the bed, scanning the notes. There were many pages. Too many. Observations from different specialists, each one detailed, each one slightly different from the last. It felt crowded, not physically, but mentally, like too many voices trying to explain something that refused to be explained. She looked at the patient again. There was something she couldn't quite name. Not something obvious. Not something she could point to and say, "That's it." But a feeling. A small sense that something didn't fully match what she was seeing. She adjusted the blanket slightly, more out of habit than necessity. Her eyes moved to the monitor again. Then to the patient's hands. Then back to the chart. Small details. Tiny things. Nothing she could explain yet. Footsteps approached, and she stepped back as a senior nurse entered. "You're assigned here now?" the nurse asked. "Just checking," she replied softly. The senior nurse nodded, though her expression carried a trace of weariness. "It's a difficult case. Best to follow the instructions exactly. Everything's already been reviewed multiple times." There was no harshness in her voice, but there was a quiet message. "Trust the process. Don't overthink it." She nodded in return. "Of course." They worked side by side for a few moments in silence. Then the senior nurse moved on, leaving her alone again. She looked at the patient one more time before stepping out. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks, medication rounds, patient updates, small conversations that didn't last long enough to become meaningful. But through it all, her thoughts kept returning to that bed in the corner. 18 experts. And still no answers. That wasn't normal. Late in the afternoon, she found a quiet moment at the nurse's station. The noise had softened slightly. For the first time, she had a chance to sit, even if just for a minute. She reached for a blank sheet of paper. It wasn't something she had to do. No one had asked her to. But it was something she always did when something felt unclear. She began to write. Not full reports. Just small notes. Times. Observations. Little details she remembered from earlier. The way the patient's breathing had shifted slightly when she adjusted the blanket. The pattern of the monitor numbers, not unusual but not entirely steady either. The notes in the chart that didn't fully align. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she wrote it down anyway, because sometimes the smallest details mattered the most. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're thinking too hard on your first day." She looked up to see one of the nurses, smiling slightly. "Maybe," she replied. The nurse leaned against the counter. "That case, it pulls people in. Makes you feel like you're missing something important. But if 18 experts couldn't figure it out, it's probably not something simple." "Probably." She nodded politely, but she didn't respond right away. Because deep down, she wasn't sure she agreed. Simple didn't mean easy. And complicated didn't always mean correct. As her shift slowly came to an end, she returned once more to the corner of the ward. The curtain was closed this time. She didn't go inside. She just stood there for a moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of the monitor on the other side. Something about it stayed with her. Not loud. Not urgent. Just persistent. She turned away after a few seconds and walked toward the exit. The hallway felt longer now. The lights slightly dimmer as evening settled in. Staff moved more slowly, but the tension in the air hadn't fully disappeared. At the door she paused, just for a moment. Then she looked back. Not at the entire ward, just at that one corner. There was something there. Something small. Something everyone else had already seen, but maybe not really noticed. She didn't have answers. Not yet. But she had a feeling. And sometimes that was where everything began. The next morning, the hospital felt even heavier than before. She noticed at the moment she stepped inside. The same sounds were there, the beeping monitors, the quiet footsteps, but something underneath had shifted. It felt tighter, more urgent, like everyone was carrying a thought they didn't want to say out loud. When she reached Ward C, she didn't need to ask what had happened. The answer was already in the way people moved. A doctor stood near the nurse's station, speaking in a low but firm voice. Another flipped through a chart too quickly, as if hoping something new might appear between the pages. A nurse walked past her without the usual small nod of acknowledgement, her focus fixed straight ahead. The patient in the corner had worsened. No one said it directly at first, but it became clear within minutes. The routine had changed. Observations were more frequent. Conversations were shorter and more serious. Even the air near that part of the ward felt different. She placed her bag down and tied her hair back, her hands steady even as her thoughts began to move faster. When she approached the nurse's station, someone handed her an updated chart without looking up. "Keep a close eye today," the nurse said. "Vitals have been inconsistent." "Inconsistent how?" she asked gently. The nurse hesitated for a second, then shook her head. "That's the problem. It doesn't follow a pattern." That word stayed with her again. No pattern. She nodded and took the chart, flipping it open as she walked toward the corner. The curtain was half open this time, and the difference from yesterday was clear. The patient's breathing was still steady, but there was a faint strain now, something subtle that wouldn't stand out to someone passing by quickly. The monitor showed small fluctuations, nothing extreme, but enough to feel unsettled when compared to the previous day. She stepped inside quietly, careful not to disturb anything. Her eyes moved slowly, taking in every detail. The patient's posture, the slight tension in the fingers, the rhythm of the chest rising and falling. Again, nothing dramatic. But something wasn't right. She checked the chart more carefully this time, reading through the latest notes. New observations had been added overnight. More tests. More conclusions that didn't fully connect. One specialist suggested a rare condition. Another ruled it out. A third recommended a different approach entirely. It was as if each expert had seen a different version of the same problem. She let out a slow breath and closed the chart halfway, her fingers resting on the edge of the paper. Then she looked at the monitor again. Beep, paused, beep, beep, pause. It wasn't irregular enough to trigger alarms. But it wasn't completely steady either. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in focus. She stepped closer, adjusting the position of one of the sensors just slightly, making sure it was placed correctly. The number stabilized for a moment, then shifted again, in that same quiet way. Behind her, a voice spoke. They already checked that. She turned to see a doctor standing near the entrance of the curtain. "I'm just making sure," she replied calmly. The doctor nodded, though his expression showed a hint of exhaustion. "Everyone's been making sure. That's kind of the problem. We've checked everything." There was no anger in his voice, just frustration. She understood that feeling. Still, she gave a small nod and stepped back, allowing him to move forward. He reviewed the monitor, glanced at the chart, then sighed quietly. "If you notice anything unusual," he said, almost as an afterthought, "write it down." At this point, nothing is too small. She held on to that sentence. Nothing is too small. After he left, she stayed for a few more seconds, her attention fixed on the patient. Then she stepped out and returned to her duties. The ward didn't slow down. If anything, it grew busier as the day progressed. More staff came in and out. Updates were given in quick bursts. Decisions were made, adjusted, then questioned again. And through it all, she kept watching. Not just the patient, but everything around the case. She noticed how often the same tests were repeated, almost as if people were hoping for a different answer each time. She noticed how certain details were mentioned briefly, then forgotten in the rush to focus on bigger possibilities. She noticed the patterns in the conversations.
Or rather, the lack of them. By midday, she found another quiet moment and returned to her notes. The paper from yesterday was still there, folded neatly. She opened it and began adding more. Time of changes, monitor fluctuations, small physical signs she had observed again that morning. Then she paused. Her pen hovered over the page as she thought carefully. If there was no pattern, why did it feel like there was one? Maybe it wasn't obvious. Maybe it wasn't where everyone else was looking. She flipped back to the chart in her memory, recalling the notes she had read earlier. Different experts, different conclusions. But what if they were all focusing on the wrong layer of the problem? Her thoughts were interrupted again by a nearby conversation. "We're running out of options," one doctor said quietly. "We can't just keep guessing," another replied. "There has to be something we're missing." Missing. That word echoed in her mind. She looked down at her notes again. Small details. Things that didn't seem important on their own. But together, she wasn't sure yet, and she knew better than to jump to conclusions. Still, the feeling grew stronger. Later in the afternoon, she returned once more to the corner. This time, the curtain was fully open. Several staff members stood nearby, reviewing something on a tablet. Their voices were low, serious. She waited at a respectful distance, not wanting to interrupt. After a moment, one of them stepped away, giving her a chance to approach. She moved closer, her steps quiet. The patient looked almost the same as before, but not exactly. There was a slight shift in the position of the head. The breathing seemed just a bit more uneven. Again, nothing dramatic, but consistent. Consistently small changes. She checked the monitor again. Beep, pause, beep. Her eyes followed the rhythm. Then she looked at the patient's hand. Faint movement. Almost unnoticeable. She leaned in slightly, watching more closely. There it was again. A small, almost instinctive response. Not random. Not entirely. Her heart beat a little faster, not from fear, but from focus. She glanced at the chart again, flipping through the latest entries. No one had mentioned that. Or maybe they had, briefly, before moving on to something else. She straightened up slowly, her thoughts beginning to connect in a way she couldn't fully explain yet. Pattern didn't have to be obvious. Sometimes it was hidden in things people considered too small to matter. As the evening approached, the ward grew quieter again, but the tension remained. She finished her tasks carefully, her movements steady, her attention sharp. Before her shift ended, she returned to her notes one last time. This time, she didn't just write observations. She started grouping them. Small changes in timing, subtle physical responses, monitor fluctuations that seemed random until they didn't. Her pen moved slowly, thoughtfully. She wasn't trying to prove anything. Not yet. She was just trying to understand. A nurse passed by and glanced at her paper. "You're still on that?" she asked lightly. She smiled faintly. "Just organizing my thoughts." The nurse shook her head with a soft laugh. "You'll drive yourself crazy. Some things just don't make sense. Maybe. But some things did. You just had to look at them differently." As her shift finally came to an end, she folded the paper carefully and slipped it into her bag. She stood up, her body tired but her mind awake. At the door, she paused again, just like the day before. Her eyes moved toward the corner. The patient was still there, still quiet, still surrounded by questions no one had answered. But now something felt different. Not in the ward. In her. She didn't have the full picture. Not yet. But she was starting to see pieces. Small ones. The kind everyone else had already seen, but maybe hadn't truly noticed. And for the first time, she allowed herself to wonder, what if the answer wasn't hidden in something complicated? What if it had been there all along, waiting quietly for someone to pay attention? The third day began more quietly, but the silence did not feel calm. Felt watchful. She arrived a little earlier than her shift, something she didn't usually do. The sky outside was still pale, and the hospital lights seemed brighter against the early morning dimness. Inside, the halls were less crowded, but the tension from the previous day had not faded. It had settled deeper. When she reached Ward C, only a few staff members were present. The usual rush had not started yet. Papers were being organized, monitors checked, and updates reviewed in low voices. She greeted a nurse softly and moved toward the station. No one stopped her. No one asked questions. It gave her a small window, time to think before everything sped up again. She placed her bag down and took out the folded sheet of paper she had been working on. The edges were slightly worn now from being opened and closed so many times. She smoothed it out on the counter and looked at it again. The notes no longer felt scattered. They were starting to form something. Not a full answer. Not yet. But a direction. She traced one line lightly with her finger. The timing of the monitor changes. Then another. The small movements she had noticed in the patient's hand. Then another. The way certain readings shifted shortly after specific adjustments. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they felt connected. Her eyes narrowed slightly, not in confusion, but in concentration. She flipped the paper over and began writing again, this time more carefully. She drew small lines between certain notes, grouping them. Then she paused, her pen hovering. Was she seeing a pattern? Or was she trying too hard to create one? That question mattered, because if she was wrong, she would only add more noise to a situation already full of it. But if she was right, she folded the paper again, slower this time, and placed it back in her bag. The ward began to fill with people as the morning moved forward. Conversations grew louder, footsteps quicker, and the quiet moment she had found disappeared. She picked up her duties and moved with the rhythm of the ward, but her focus remained steady. When she approached the corner, she noticed something immediately. The curtain was open again. 2 doctors stood inside, reviewing the monitor closely. Their expressions were serious, but not surprised, as if they were expecting what they were seeing. She waited just outside, not wanting to interrupt. Still inconsistent, one of them said. It doesn't hold, the other replied. We adjust, it stabilizes briefly, then shifts again. The first doctor nodded, like something is triggering it, but we can't find what. Triggering it. Her attention sharpened. After a moment, the doctors stepped out, their conversation continuing as they walked away. She watched them go, then stepped inside. The patient looked the same at first glance, but she had learned not to trust first glances. She moved closer, her eyes scanning slowly. The breathing, the hands, the monitor. Beep, pause, beep. Her mind replayed her notes from earlier. Timing, reactions, small changes. She reached out and adjusted the blanket slightly, just as she had done before. Then she waited. A few seconds passed. Then, a shift, so small it would be easy to miss. The monitor flickered slightly, the rhythm changing just enough to catch her attention. Her heart beat a little faster. She didn't move. She just watched. Another few seconds. Then the pattern returned to what it had been before. She stepped back slowly, her thoughts racing now, but her expression calm. That wasn't random. She knew it. But knowing it and proving it were two very different things. Footsteps approached again, and this time a senior doctor entered. He glanced at her briefly. Everything all right? Yes, she replied, then hesitated for just a second. This was the moment. A small one, but important. I noticed something, she said carefully. The doctor paused, giving her his full attention, though his expression remained neutral. What is it? She chose her words slowly, making sure she didn't overstate anything. The monitor changes. They seem to happen after small adjustments. Not immediately, but shortly after. The doctor frowned slightly. Adjustments like what? She gestured lightly toward the bed. Positioning, contact, even minor movements. He considered that for a moment, then shook his head gently. We've looked into external factors, he said. There's no consistent trigger. She nodded as if accepting his answer. But inside, something didn't settle. I understand, she said softly. He gave a small nod and moved past her to check the patient himself. She stepped aside, allowing him space. For a moment, she wondered if she had spoken too soon, if she should have waited until she had something clearer, something stronger. But then she remembered his words from yesterday. Nothing is too small. Still, the conversation ended there, and she returned to her duties. The rest of the morning passed quickly, but her thoughts stayed anchored to that moment. She replayed it again and again. What she had seen, what she had said, and how easily it had been set aside. It didn't frustrate her. Not exactly. She understood why. 18 experts had already studied this case. They had considered possibilities far more complex than what she was suggesting. Why would they focus on something so small? Unless It wasn't small at all. By midday, she found herself back at the nurse's station, her paper in front of her once again. This time she added something new. She wrote down the exact moment she had adjusted the blanket. Then the delay before the monitor changed. Then the return to baseline. She stared at the sequence. Then she flipped back to her earlier notes. There it was again. Not identical, but similar. Her fingers tightened slightly around the pen. This wasn't coincidence. Couldn't be. But she still needed more. More proof. More clarity. More confidence. Because speaking up once and being dismissed was one thing. Speaking up again meant being certain. The afternoon brought more activity. More tests. More discussions. And still no clear answers. She continued her work quietly, but her attention had shifted completely now. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was looking for confirmation. Late in the day, she returned to the patient again. This time, no one else was nearby. The ward was busy, but the corner was momentarily quiet. She stepped inside, her movements calm. Then, slowly, she made another small adjustment. Not enough to disturb, just enough to observe. And then she waited, her eyes fixed on the monitor. Seconds passed. Then, there it was again. The same subtle shift. The same delay. The same return. Her breath caught slightly, though she didn't let it show. She had seen it now. More than once. Her mind moved quickly, connecting the pieces. This wasn't random. It wasn't unpredictable. It was being missed. Because it didn't look important. Because it didn't happen immediately. Because it required patience to notice. She stepped back, her heart steady but her thoughts alive. Now she knew, or at least she knew enough to keep going. But there was still a problem. No one else saw it. Or if they did, they didn't see it as meaningful. And that meant she had a choice. Stay quiet, or try again. She looked at the patient one more time, then at the monitor, then down at her hands. They were steady. She wasn't afraid, but she was careful. Because in a place like this, speaking up without certainty didn't just risk being ignored. It risked being dismissed entirely. As her shift came to an end, she gathered her things slowly. Her paper was no longer just notes. It was evidence. Incomplete, but growing. She slipped it into her bag and stood up. At the door, she paused again. That familiar moment. That quiet hesitation. Her eyes moved to the corner. Something had changed. Not in the patient. In her understanding. She wasn't guessing anymore. She was seeing. And that made everything different. But it also made the next step harder. Because now she couldn't ignore it. Now she had to decide how to make others see it too. The fourth day did not begin like the others. There was no quiet moment for her to settle in. No time to observe from a distance. The ward was already active when she arrived. Voices overlapping. Footsteps moving faster than usual. Something had shifted again, and this time it felt closer to urgency than before. She placed her bag down quickly and stepped into the flow of the morning without hesitation. A nurse handed her a chart mid-step, and she caught it without breaking her pace. "Keep an eye on that case," the nurse said, her voice lower than usual. There were more changes overnight. She nodded, already moving toward the corner. When she reached the bed, she noticed the difference immediately. The monitor showed sharper fluctuations now. Not alarming, but more noticeable than before. The patient's breathing carried a faint irregularity, like something was interrupting its natural rhythm. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough. Enough to make people uneasy. Two doctors stood nearby, reviewing updated results. Their conversation was tense, controlled, but clearly strained. "We adjusted everything," one said. "It should have stabilized." "It did," the other replied. "For a while. For a while isn't enough." She stood just outside the curtain, listening without meaning to. The words confirmed what she had already been seeing. Temporary stability, then change again. The same cycle. Her grip tightened slightly on the chart in her hands. This was it. The pattern was becoming harder to ignore. She stepped inside quietly. No one stopped her. She moved closer to the monitor, her eyes scanning the numbers, the rhythm, the small pauses that didn't belong. Beep, pause, beep, beep. Her mind didn't race this time. Focused. Because now she wasn't just observing. She was certain. Not about everything, but about enough. One of the doctors glanced at her. Any updates? She took a small breath. This was different from before. Before, she had spoken carefully, unsure. Now, her voice carried a quiet steadiness. I think the changes aren't random, she said. The doctor looked at her more closely now. What do you mean? She stepped slightly closer to the monitor, but not too close. They follow something, she continued. Not immediately. There's always a delay, but it's consistent. The second doctor frowned. Consistent with what? She hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Then she reached out and adjusted the edge of the blanket again. Not enough to disturb. Just enough. Watch, she said softly. Both doctors shifted their attention to the monitor. A few seconds passed. Nothing. Then, a small change. Subtle. But there. The rhythm shifted. Then slowly returned. The first doctor's expression changed slightly. Not fully convinced. But no longer dismissive. That could be coincidence, he said. She nodded. It could be. But it's happened more than once. How many times? The second doctor asked. She met his gaze. Enough for it to repeat. There was a brief silence. Not long, but enough. The kind of silence where something begins to shift. Do it again, the first doctor said. She didn't rush. She adjusted the blanket once more, just slightly, then stepped back. They all watched. Seconds passed. The monitor held steady. Then, another shift. The same delay. The same subtle change. This time, neither doctor spoke immediately. Their eyes remained on the screen. Then one of them turned toward the chart, flipping it open quickly. Check the previous logs, he said. The other moved closer, scanning the entries. Look at the timing, the first added. She stayed where she was, silent now. She didn't need to explain further. Not yet, because now they were looking. Really looking. What if it's not the adjustment itself? The second doctor said slowly. But something connected to it? The first nodded. A response. Not immediate. Delayed. They both looked back at the patient. Then at the monitor. Then at each other. The tension in the air didn't disappear. But it changed. It shifted from confusion to focus. More staff were called over one by one. A senior doctor joined them, his presence drawing a quiet seriousness into the space. What's going on? He asked. The first doctor gestured toward the monitor. We might have missed something. She stepped back slightly, giving them room. The explanation was brief but clear. The observations, the repetition, the delay. The senior doctor listened without interruption, his eyes moving between the monitor and the patient. Then he looked at her. You noticed this? He asked. She nodded. How long? Since yesterday, she replied. Maybe earlier. I wasn't sure at first. He held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. Show me. She stepped forward again, her movements steady despite the attention now on her. She made the same small adjustment, then waited. This time, everyone watched. Seconds passed. The monitor held. Then, the shift came again. Clearer now, not because it was stronger, but because they were all looking for it. The senior doctor's expression tightened slightly. Again, he said. She repeated the action. And again, the same result. Pattern. Not loud. Not obvious. But undeniable. The room felt different now. No one spoke for a few seconds. Then the senior doctor turned to the others. We've been focusing on the condition itself, he said slowly. But this suggests a response. Something reactive. A trigger? Someone asked. Not immediate, he replied. But yes, something connected. He looked back at the chart, flipping through pages faster now, his focus sharpened. Cross-check all previous observations, he said. Look for delayed responses, not just immediate ones. The team moved quickly. The energy in the room changed again. Not rushed. Directed. She stepped back fully now, her role shifting without needing to be stated. She wasn't leading, but she had opened something, and now they were following it. Minutes passed as they reviewed past data. Quiet conversations filled the space, but they were different now. Less scattered, more connected. "I see it here," one of the doctors said, pointing at a page. "It happened after repositioning." "And here," another added. "We didn't notice it because it didn't happen right away." The senior doctor nodded slowly. "We were looking for immediate cause and effect," he said. "We ignored the delay." He looked up. "And that's where we missed it." The words settled heavily, not as blame, but as realization. She stood quietly at the edge of the group, watching. No one praised her. No one needed to. This wasn't about recognition. It was about understanding. And that was finally happening. The senior doctor turned toward her again. "You did well to keep track of it," he said. She gave a small nod. "I just wrote down what I saw." "That's more than most people do," he replied. Then he turned back to the team. "Adjust the approach," he said. "Slow it down. Observe responses over time, not just immediately." Orders were given. Changes were made. Carefully. Thoughtfully. Not rushed. And for the first time since she had arrived, the ward didn't feel stuck. Felt like it was moving forward. As the day continued, the adjustments began to show small differences. Nothing dramatic. Nothing immediate. But the cycle, the repeating uncertainty, started to ease. The monitor still shifted. But now they understood why. And that changed everything. Later, when the activity slowed just slightly, she found herself near the nurse's station again. The same place where she had first written her notes. She took out the paper once more and looked at it. The lines. The connections. The small details that had seemed almost invisible at first. She didn't add anything new. She didn't need to, because now those details were no longer hers alone. They were part of the case. A nurse passed by and glanced at her. "They're saying the pattern makes sense now," she said quietly. She looked up. "It does." The nurse studied her for a moment, then smiled faintly. "You saw it before anyone else." She shook her head gently. "It was always there. That was the truth." She hadn't created anything. She had just noticed. As her shift came to an end, she walked once more toward the exit. But this time, when she paused, it felt different. She looked back at the corner. The curtain was still open. The patient was still there. But the uncertainty that once surrounded that bed had begun to fade. Not completely, but enough. Enough to bring hope back into the room. She stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked out. Quietly, just as she always had. But now, the silence around her felt lighter. Because something important had finally been seen. And everything was beginning to change. The days that followed did not bring sudden miracles. There was no single moment where everything changed at once. No dramatic shift that made people stop and stare. Instead, the progress came quietly, in small steps that only those paying close attention could truly see. When she returned for her next shift, the ward felt different. Not calmer exactly, but steadier. The tension that had once filled the space had softened into something more focused. Conversations were still serious, but they no longer carried the same weight of confusion. There was direction now, a sense that the team finally understood what they were dealing with, even if they were still working through it. She placed her bag down and walked toward the nurse's station. Someone handed her the updated chart without needing to ask. This time, there was something new in their eyes when they looked at her. Not curiosity, not doubt, something quieter. Respect, maybe, or simply acknowledgement. She didn't hold onto it for long. She opened the chart and began reading. The notes were clearer now. Observations were written with more patience, more attention to timing. Delays were no longer ignored. Small responses were recorded carefully, not brushed aside. The pattern she had noticed had become part of the process. She closed the chart gently and made her way toward the corner. The curtain was open, just like the day before. The patient lay in the same position, but there was a difference. A small one. The breathing was more even. Not perfect, but better. She stepped closer, her movements calm as always. Her eyes moved to the monitor. Beep, beep, pause, beep. The rhythm still wasn't completely steady, but the sharp fluctuations had softened. The changes that once came unexpectedly now followed a pattern the team understood. They had adjusted their approach. Slower movements, more careful timing, less interruption. They weren't trying to control everything at once anymore. They were listening. That made all the difference. A doctor stood nearby, reviewing the latest updates. He glanced at her as she approached, then gave a small nod. "It's improving," he said quietly. She nodded back. "I can see that." He looked at the monitor again, then at the patient. "We were pushing too fast," he admitted, trying to fix everything immediately. She didn't respond right away, because she knew that wasn't easy to say. Not in a place like this where people were trained to act quickly, to solve problems without hesitation. But sometimes slowing down was the answer. "We thought the changes were random," he continued. "We didn't consider that we were causing them." She looked at the patient's hand again, still, but relaxed. "It's easy to miss small things," she said softly. He let out a quiet breath. "Yes, it is." They stood in silence for a moment, both watching the steady rhythm of the monitor. Then he turned back to his work, and she continued hers. The day moved forward, not rushed, not heavy, just steady. Each small task felt more purposeful now. Each observation carried meaning. The ward still demanded attention, still required care, but it no longer felt like they were working against something unknown. They were working with understanding. By midday, the improvement became clearer. The patient's breathing had grown more consistent. The monitor showed fewer interruptions. The delayed responses were still there, but they were predictable now, expected, managed. She updated the chart carefully, writing each observation with the same attention she had given her personal notes days before. Time, response, change. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. A nurse approached her quietly. "They're saying the worst has passed." She looked up. "That's good." The nurse studied her for a second. "You don't sound surprised." She gave a faint smile. "I was hoping for it." That was the truth. She had never been certain of the outcome, but she had trusted what she saw. And sometimes that was enough to guide the way forward. Later in the afternoon, a small group of doctors gathered near the station. Their conversation was calm, reflective. "We kept looking for something complex," one of them said, "because it felt like it had to be," another replied. "And it wasn't," the first said quietly. They didn't sound embarrassed. They sounded thoughtful, as if they were learning something they wouldn't forget. She passed by them without interrupting, her attention still on her work. She didn't need to be part of that conversation. It wasn't about being right. It was about the patient. And the patient was getting better. That was enough. Toward the end of her shift, she returned to the corner once more. The room felt lighter now. Not empty, not quiet, just easier. She stepped inside and adjusted the blanket gently, just as she had done on the first day. This time, she didn't wait for the monitor to change. She already knew it would, and she knew why. The patient's eyes shifted slightly, just for a moment. It was small, so small that someone standing at a distance might not notice. But she did. She paused, her attention softening. Then the eyes settled again. But something had changed. A sign. A quiet one, but real. She stepped back slowly, a sense of calm settling over her. When she left the room, she noticed the senior doctor standing nearby. He looked at her, then at the patient. "Better," he said. "Yes," she replied. He nodded. Then after a brief pause, he added, "We would have taken much longer to see it." She didn't respond immediately, because she wasn't sure that mattered. "You saw it," he continued. "That's what matters." She gave a small, thoughtful nod. But inside, she held on to a different thought. It wasn't about seeing. It was about noticing. There was a difference. As her shift came to an end, she returned to the nurse's station one last time. Her paper was still in her bag. She took it out and looked at it. The same notes, the same small details. but they felt different now. Not because they had changed, but because they had been understood. She folded the paper carefully and placed it back inside. Not as something unfinished, but as something complete. A quiet record of a moment that had mattered. When she walked toward the exit, the hallway didn't feel as long as it had on her first day. The lights didn't feel as harsh. The sounds didn't feel as heavy. She reached the door and paused, just as she had every day before. Then she looked back. The ward continued its rhythm. Patients resting, staff moving, life going on. And in that corner, behind the open curtain, was a reminder. Not of failure, but of learning. Of how easily something important could be overlooked. And how powerful it could be when someone chose to pay attention. She turned and stepped outside. The air felt different, lighter. She adjusted the strap of her bag and began walking. No one followed her. No one called her back. And she didn't expect them to, because what needed to happen had already happened. The patient was recovering. The team had learned. And the quiet nurse who had once stood unnoticed at the edge of the room had done something simple. She had listened. She had watched. She had trusted what others had overlooked. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone of something they already knew, but had forgotten in the rush of experience and expertise. That sometimes, the answer isn't hidden in something complicated. Sometimes it's right there, waiting, in the smallest detail, in the quietest moment, in the thing everyone sees, but no one truly notices.